part of the system. I was very lucky in my personal purview that when I was at my most vulnerable in hospital with my health, I received very good care, at least as far as I know. I know just as many people that don't. It's obviously the system has problems, but it seems as though when you're going to the BBC, Sky News, who seem to, for lack of a better term, toe the establishment line, they're not going to really publish things that are going to put the system that's in place into disrepute. So I'm not really too surprised by that. Similar to, coming back to it again, because this is something I believe in the call you mentioned, that this is something you completely changed your stance on in a big way, is that especially with these mothers-to-be, they were, again, talking about putting policy over nurturing kind of thing. Am I right in saying there were dates that they were given that they were going to be induced, and a lot of the times then they either missed the date, so there was no updates or anything like that, giving them this fear about being induced, like however long it was in advance, telling them they had to be here on this date and then it would never happen, but then also pushing like things like vaccines on them despite knowing complications associated with them, where you mentioned for things like blood pressure issues which went up, pregnancy bleeds that went up, is it abruption? Is that one of them? Abruption that went up, postnatal bleeding, blood clots and sudden deaths, all of these things at a times two vaccines commonality you mentioned. Is these things really things that we got to be worried about, especially like if you're thinking about bringing children into the world and stuff like that?
Yeah, absolutely. There's a lot to unpick there, George. There's an awful lot.
Yes.
But if you think the role of a midwife is to provide holistic care, as they say, and give informed choice and provide evidence-based practice, that's drummed into you. But most people don't know how to read evidence, including myself. I don't know fully how to understand all of it. It's very, very difficult to understand, all the numbers or the p-values. People just don't. And because they use different models of research, it's really hard to understand them all. You might know the basics of, your systematic review or your gold standard stuff, but, quantitative over qualitative is a lot harder for some people to understand. So the majority of people wouldn't go and say, hold on, before I give that drug, I'd really like to go and read the evidence on it, because the system is set up that you don't have time to do that. And if you do that, you'll then become a problem, because the system will say, well, you're too slow for the system, so we really need to move you. So you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't. However, I'm a perfectionist and I have to do things properly. So my NMC record is exemplary. I never had any feedback from any patients that I was aware of. The trust might have had some and they rebutted it, whatever, I don't know. So I've never been called in on a cause for concern, or, I've never been part of any investigation. I've only ever once or twice written a recollection of events. So in all, that's an exemplary career in the system that we're in. But you're also not trained to critically analyse. It's either in you or it's not. I think it's part of breaking down your qualities of who you are. So if I saw women coming into triage with sickness and diarrhea and they all lived in a particular part of Plymouth, I would be thinking, oh, is there a bug in the area, or have they all bought something from the local shop? Or do you know what I mean? Is the water contaminated? So when COVID hit, and you got to remember, I think pregnant women were probably the easiest thing to figure out, because they didn't have the vaccines at all for the first year. So when COVID struck, the women that were pregnant were told to isolate and be at home. Now, those women weren't vaccinated in the first year. So when those women came in, the adverse effects weren't any different. The outcomes weren't any different. The mental health was different. Of course, the suicide was the biggest killer of women. So when I saw the first COVID patient come in, we were all sat there. When I think back on this in my experience, I think, oh my God, what was I even thinking? I was waiting in anticipation as this lady walked down the corridor just to see if she looked like an alien. What's she going to look like? What does COVID look like? And she just donned in with a little mask on and her bump and hello, and just walked in, and I thought, oh, she's normal. She didn't even know she had COVID. It just came up on her test, of course. So in she goes to the room and we're all like, oh, it's the first COVID. Everyone's whispering the COVID positive, COVID positive. And then over time, now I had a lot of sickness between 2020 and 2023. That time I took a lot of time off sick, but that was a lot of the time I was doing my reflecting. I was really going in a rabbit hole. I was doing my digging on everything about, the UN and looking at where the money's coming from. And I went dark. And I mean, to the point that I think I sat and rocked on the sofa for about 7 weeks at one point. I was like, what is this really happening? So in 2020, I hadn't quite put my finger on that something was amiss. So I had a vaccine myself. I think I had the first one in 2020 and then 2021 had the second one. So what I was seeing was this little increase in baby deaths. And because midwives don't see miscarriage because they're on a different ward in a different space, they've segregated it out over years on purpose, I believe, for this very plan. So you don't follow your women. You never follow your women's outcomes. And then what law did they put in? GDPR. You can't chase your women's data. You can't chase I wonder if Mary is okay after her horrible abruption. Let's Google it or let's go on the system and have a look. And you can't. So you can never follow trends. You can never see outcome and you can never, ever, ever look up the medical report or whatever the findings are on the patient. So they're all locked away under GDPR. That's no coincidence. That's very orchestrated.
Seems as though they're deliberately trying to keep you guys like ignorant in the dark. That's what it seems as though they're trying to do. As to what's happening as it goes along.
Yeah, it's like the police though had the same. The GDPR law affects us all. So then when the baby death started to increase and it got a little bit more busier, I started realizing that I never myself ever had a COVID positive patient. I never saw it. My colleagues say they did, but nobody that I know was significantly sick from COVID. Pregnant women were actually probably a lot more protected in their pregnancy. So as the vaccine rollout's now in, you're seeing the increase in baby deaths. It's not difficult to see that. So then in 22 to 23 was the bad years. So you saw your wards were rammed, your beds blocks were rammed. Most of these women had multiple vaccines, especially if they had 2 or 3 babies in over those years. They were cranked up. And you've got to remember in pregnancy, they have to have flu, whooping cough and COVID all in the second trimester. And what is the statistics coming out of the Peter McCulloch Foundation? The baby deaths and the miscarriage rate and the preterm birth and the abruption is mainly in the second trimester. We're also seeing fertility drop 1.44 per child per woman. That means we're below the civilization rate to reproduce our civilization. So it took a lot for me to unpick it because what I didn't get was the dangling moment that said, the eureka moment that said, this is depopulation, Victoria, it's an agenda. And it took me a long time to really get there and not rebut it when it got to me. I had to think, I'll rebut this, but it didn't. So, yeah, that was really the outcome of that really disastrous period in my career. And then it was the mass harm after. So you were then seeing so many women with raised blood pressure. And we know that the vaccines were impacting the kidneys, which is the adrenals, which is part of the blood pressure system. And yeah, it was pretty horrendous, George, to be honest. I just felt like I was giving out drugs all the time. And, it was just really stressful, really sad.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think one of the big reasons, because I worked in my local sports centre at the time, and when the lockdowns first hit, they repurposed us and put us on the furlough system, and then we were actually on the local vaccine rollout clinic. Some of us were helping out indoors, bringing vaccines to the nurses that were administering them. Some of us were out in the car park enforcing social distancing, all these things. That's where we were. And we had to have it initially in order to do that. We were volunteering. We weren't forced into it or anything like that, but we did have to have it before we started if we were going to. So I was one of the first people in my local community, at least I know, that had it. Because obviously the first people coming in were elderlies in the top age brackets, and then gradually worked its way down to younger and younger people. But I'm just thinking back to it now, looking back to what it was like at the time now, and just being like, God, if the information had been available, if people weren't silenced, if people's concerns were actually, heard, if people were allowed to voice their criticisms of it, so at least people could make a better informed decision. Like people, for example, were saying it was safe, it was effective, then it went to it stops transmission and all of these things that later turned out to not be true. But I knew that being 20, 21, 22, 23 years old at the time, I can't remember, my mind's gone blank, I can't remember exactly how old I was.
Oh,
this is
so
ridiculous.
old.
Yeah, exactly. And one of the people that I was, very physically healthy, because I was a PT and fitness instructor, I knew that I was physically healthy. To me, it wasn't going to be much of an issue. I knew that. It might, knock me on my ass for a couple of days, but it's not like it's going to kill me.
Yeah.
To my elderly grandparent, on the other hand, to my dad who's immunocompromised with COPD, emphysema and stuff like that, who's in his 70s, to my mother who's slightly on the older side, I'm thinking about them. I'm thinking, oh, it stops transmission. Oh, okay, there we go. That was my case then for taking it, not because it was really endangered to myself. And looking back at it now, I wouldn't have taken it, especially when you see the horrific videos coming out.
That was the beauty of some of us. We didn't put ourselves first. That is humanity. It's about putting others before you. That is part of being a good human being. You did that for your parents. I did that for all of those mums and babies and my own children. So it doesn't make you bad.
All right. And we're back. Apologies about that, ladies and gentlemen. I'm going to say, Victoria, with all the technical difficulties we have today, next time, if you're ever on the podcast again, which I really hope that we do, I'm coming down to Devon. I hope you know that. I'm coming down to Devon. We're doing this in person because this has been, the technical difficulties have been an absolute travesty tonight. But anyway, where were we? It was to do with the vaccines and the how much they were pushed on people. So again, we're mentioning that large reasons, and this is, I know, not just for me, and how people were talking about it before, especially people around our age groups, who weren't necessarily focused on it too much for ourselves. We focused on it because of our elderly relatives and stuff like that, and how much it was fear mongered into us. And looking back on it now, you only have to go online and type in like vaccine complications, and you have the videos of footballers in the prime of their life just falling over, damn near dropping dead. There was this horrific video I saw of this doctor pulling out this blood clot that honestly looked like something out of the Alien films. It was absolutely ridiculous. And the thing that really drives the stake into the heart of this issue is that all the evidence seems to point to is that they knew this in advance. And you mentioned the word depopulation. I can't think of a better word to describe it. And I know people, when we mention that word, all of a sudden people imagine tinfoil hat wearing weirdos, right? I hope you guys understand that this is not where that conversation is coming from. This is really, really a real thing. This is a real thing. There are people that want to drop the population in the world by massive amounts because smaller populations are easier to control. That was one of the things that the UN Agenda 2030 space that we were just on, or that I was listening to, that you were a part of, Victoria, earlier on this evening, was talking about. And especially like the UN, the World Economic Forum, and the World Health Organization, there's a really, really sinister agenda at play. And we're only seeing like the really far downstream effects of that. How much, again, was it pushed and incentivized by like upper management and stuff like that to really push these vaccines on people, despite notions of like choice and stuff like that? Because it does seem that choice is not at this, like choice on the part of the parent to be, for example, doesn't seem to be at the heart of the policy from what I've seen.
I was quite an easygoing midwife. If a woman said to me she didn't want a vaccine, I'd go, no problem. I was just quite easygoing. I think that's that. It comes from if you are someone that is healed in yourself and you don't run on any ego and you're not triggered by anything that anybody else decides, then you're just responsible for you. So why does somebody else's decision bother you so much? So when the vaccine rollout was coming, I obviously trusted my union, the Royal College of Midwives. There's that word, the Royal College. We know that the Royal College, I've just seen something today. Why do we even have Royal Colleges? So when I've got a union who has been a credible, I say that in, loose terms, incredible, a union support for over 100 years. Oh, well, particularly their union was quite more recent. But the actual education side of the Royal College of Midwives has been ongoing for a long, long time. So you don't doubt these people who you've known for or known of, whether it's a governing body, an actual NHS with its trust values, core values, whatever you want to call it, employment law, health and safety law, all of that. Why would I doubt it? Why would I doubt that? So for me, it was difficult. But as soon as I knew, and they came at me with a Warren's Bakery bacon roll to have COVID jab in one arm and the flu in the other, I was like, no. And I remember my boss coming up to me with the sharps bin, and she said, "You're vulnerable." And I was like, no, I'm not. Well, you've got diabetes. And I was like, and? Doesn't mean anything. If anything's going to kill me, it's diabetes, okay? Because that's the worst thing. But to stick that in my arm, that's not going to happen. So they were obviously trying to incentivize Warren's, which now I know Warren's have made a huge amount of money through the hospital because it's Warren's Bakery, which is in the foyer of the hospital. Why are you taking a vaccine for and I was just like, oh my God, what are they doing? So it was a lot of that just started to make me think, you're not just pushing this, and you're now incentivizing having a vaccine. But the other day I got a letter from the NHS that said, join our trial for blood pressure and you'll get a £10 voucher. Could you imagine how many people are skint at the minute and will do that? My father-in-law got one because I was looking after him after his recent collapsed lung. And I just put it straight in the bin. I was like, don't even get involved. Don't do it. So I just think the majority of the NHS took up the vaccine, didn't they? And now I'm not going to say any names, but I met a nurse recently who said to me, I had 2 vaccines and I wouldn't go near him now. So over 80% of the NHS staff have not taken up the COVID vaccine, which has now dropped the flu vaccine uptake naturally with a questionable evidence.
Yeah, I think the biggest, one of the biggest things I took away from that interview I mentioned with Michael Knowles and Andy Wakefield was that I believe it was just around the turn of the century, just as Tony Blair came in as Prime Minister, that really goes back to just questioning the motives that these things are coming from. Because he mentioned that, when antibiotics first came on the scene, or when vaccines first came on the scene, whether it was polio or whatever, it was like life-changing. People were dying of all these things so early. Life expectancy was awful. When they first came on, it was, truly a miracle in many instances. And now due to overuse and abuse and things like that, obviously, we now have things like, what do they call them, like super bacteria and all things like that, really hyper-resistant stuff. But just goes to show that I believe, according to Andy Wakefield anyways, in this country, when people were questioning the MMR vaccine, so having measles, mumps, and rubella all at the same time, and initially you were able to get the vaccines all separately, and it's pretty much not long after Blair came in, he stopped the importation of the individual vaccines, so you couldn't just go and get a measles vaccine. You couldn't just go and get rubella vaccine, whatever it was. You had to get them all together. Despite knowing that there was interference patterns with the way these vaccines acted, and that they can cause potentially really bad effects when you mix them together. But the safety trials hadn't been done. They were done, you'd expect them to be done over like 10 years or whatever, but they were only done over like 5 days. It was truly harrowing. And I believe you go back to the Blair administration, I think is when a lot of the problems in this country really, really started, if you ask me, just from a bunch of other things, things in the, conflicts around the world and all stuff like that. But the way I visualized it, what seems to be going on, and why I want to ask you, like, whether it's the UN, whether it's these other agendas that are at play, or these organizations that are at play, the way I sort of see it, I don't know if you've ever seen the documentary on Netflix known as Fear City. It's about the mob in New York in the 80s and how they took them down. And they were giving this visual about how the mob is set up. So you have like the soldiers that are underneath these, the captains, and then you have the captains that report to the underboss, and then you have the boss at the top. So you have this very hierarchical structure within the family. And sort of drew me a parallel between that. You sort of have like the midwives that are operating. I'm not comparing midwives directly to mafia soldiers.
Just
by
so
the way,
I'm
I
not offended
want to
by
make that
anything that you
perfect.
say, George.
I want to make that perfectly clear. I'm not directly comparing the two,
I'm
but you
not
have the
offended by anything you say. Don't worry.
There you go. You had the midwives that sort of carry out the bidding of the captains, which I liken to the managers in this instance, just carrying out, the orders that they're told to. And then you're obviously going to have something at the top. Do we have like any idea on what that sort of is, or am I really digging deep into conspiracy theories here?
No, I think when you follow the money, when you start looking at the money and you start looking at your country and you start looking at the history of your country, and then you look. So let's take the NHS for instance. It was born in 1947, and back then, and let's just particularly focus on maternity. Back then, every woman delivered at home, pretty much with a doctor's support if needed. Between 1947 and 1970s, it tipped and everybody delivered in hospital very quickly. Now, when people say, "Oh, so many people died," yeah, but who's given us our data? The people that run the world. So now I question everything and I say, well, if we've only ever had stillbirth data from one entity and that's the NHS, how do we know it's accurate? How do we not know that the stillbirth data has projected a poor model of care into making money? So people argue with me, oh, the stillbirth rate was 30%. Well, how do you know? Well, the NHS told me. What, you trust the NHS that's just put a jab in you that can kill you and give you myocarditis and you drop dead with white clots? Hello. This is my argument now. I'm like, I think we all have to sit on the fence now and start thinking, well, and make our own decisions. So when I think about that, and I think about the people that birthed at home cost nothing but the midwife's time, yeah? You think now there are 600,000 births a year on average. It's dropped, the fertility rates, the birth rates. Half of those women are induced, and just under half of those women have a cesarean section. Now, a cesarean section is around up to about $8,000, depending if you're private, or private's about 10. Why would they want you at home? You make money for the system. So when you start looking at it like that and you start thinking, well, why do they want bums in hospital beds? Why do they want birth trapped into the system? And you start looking at the money, you then start looking at your own CEO. You then start looking at who your directors are, and then you start looking at them up on Companies House, and then you start looking at some connection. Where is the money coming from? Then you start looking at where shares are, or you start digging. It's all there. The thing I've learned is if they tell you the truth and you still go ahead and use it, there's no karmic debt to repay. They've told you, and you still got on the bandwagon and had a baby in a hospital. That's how I see it, right? So when you start looking into all of that and you start looking at it that way and you learn and educate yourself in that manner, it's not possible for you to unsee it. And I don't believe anybody that goes down this road will not come across Agenda 30, the World Health Organization, the UN agenda, the Agenda 2030, the Agenda 21, which will then dig them into a theory of schooling, chemtrails. You might not believe chemtrails, do I? I do, because my friend's an ex-pilot. So did I before? Probably not. So all of these little things have opened up my world into realizing that your life is an agenda. Your life has a plan, and you are just a slave to the system. So for me, educating myself not only just on the vaccine, I, in a way, thank COVID for coming into my life, because it opened up my eyes on a scale that I'm able now to leave a different legacy for my children.
I think COVID was the big thing that opened a lot of people's eyes. And I'd go back and think, like, because I was one of those people at the time was like, oh, I could get used to this. This is fine. I'm like, I look back in horror now, realizing the power and cash transfer that it was, that, whether it be we're talking about digital ID, cashless society they were trying to groom us into when we were in school and stuff like that. They started bringing the system in then, and that's where again I go back
when
and
I
think
was
that
at
was
school,
like,
George, remember? 42. So I'm a lot older than you, steady.
no, but it was a thing. They brought it in when we were in school. It would be a little thing on the wall, and it would be linked to your fingerprint. You'd have your fingerprint in, you put your money in, and then you pay with your fingerprint. So yeah, you'd have this balance which would come up to your screen. It'd be linked to your fingerprint. This was when I was in year 7. So I would have been, this started coming in when I was in year 7. And then soon, you can just imagine that. You've only got to think that. Well, imagine that money system there, which the minute you hand over that cash, you don't have that money anymore. No. Imagine then that is linked to your political opinions. And then all of a sudden, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out how you end up with a system like communist China. It instantly it becomes apparent, and instantly it becomes apparent how the Labour government in this country tried to bring that in. And once you mentioned it before, once you see it, you can't unsee it.
No. And would you go back? Would you go back to unseeing it?
Absolutely not.
No,
absolutely not. As harrowing as it is, because ultimately it's the classic illustration of the emu that digs its head in the sand. You know what I mean? It's like, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if you dig your head into the sand. Whatever's going to be coming is going to come in. Yeah. And I hate using this term, but that it almost like is getting unplugged from the Matrix in a way. The Matrix in a way is very prophetic in this way. I don't agree with necessarily everyone that uses that term. But again, it is like once that cord has been pulled and now you see the world for what it actually is, it's like, oh shit, we're in really, really deep shit, yeah. We're in really, really deep shit. Yeah. And, especially with the government we have in the country at the moment, it's very, very scary.
Yeah, it's very, very scary. But we do have the power as people to use some of their own laws against them. And I'm using the GDPR law against 5 companies at the moment in the administrative court for using my data like I'm not entitled to withhold it from anybody. And today I had a victory in Plymouth County Court against a debt collection agency that took my data from my employer without any permission. And I think when people start grasping that you live at home and you're busy and you're working 9 till 5 and you're working to live for the weekends and you're working to live for one holiday a year, and Christmas comes around and you love a bit of autumn and you love a little bit of the pumpkin picking. Before you know it, you're back round another year again. People actually sat back and sat where I am. This time slows down and you have more time to think and you have more time to feel. And you have more time to understand and reflect and allow your heart to make the right decisions rather than your fast-paced, illogical brain that is speeding up. And I think for me, taking control of my life in every aspect, including my health, my employment, has been the most profound, because I wasn't in a good place last year. Or the year before that and the year before that. I have been in the darkest 5 years of my life. And I'm a very energetic being. I'm a very positive, optimistic person, and I couldn't see past it. It was so bad. And it wasn't just COVID. It was my health. It was my diabetes. It was all of it. So I think if people just have an open mind to looking that it isn't just you working 9 to 5 and there is another choice, and they go, well, what choice? Well, your choice. What would you choose to do and you choose to be? And if they say, well, I just choose not to work and be free, and well, go and be free and choose not to work. Because you might think it's not that simple, but it really is. It just means you've got to cut back on absolutely everything and you've got to make a different choice. And that's literally how I've lived my life, particularly more in the last 3 months. I've never felt more empowered, but my health's much harder to deal with, particularly with my diabetes when it's stressful. So I think when you say the Matrix, whatever that looks like, there is something else there outside of the world you once lived in. That is probably what you could call your own mind and matrix.